I have a lawyer, an organizer, a writer, and a speaker here with me. He's been seen quite a bit lately, but that's not what he does. He does the work. My man has been everywhere in the news since the terror charges and the assassination of climate activist Manuel Terán, or Tortuguita, Little Turtle, who was defending the Atlanta forest from a domestic terrorism training facility, Cop City, for cops around the country. Or as someone suggested, maybe another Georgia School of the Americas. My guest today, Kamau Franklin, founded Community Movement Builders, but he appears last on the group's About Us page. This is the kind of person he is. Kamau has spent more than 3 decades fighting for liberation, in case you're just meeting him now. He's been working on youth organizing, police misconduct, sustainable urban communities. He's led cop watch programs, liberation freedom schools for youth. He's worked on electoral and policy campaigns, community urban gardens, organizing collectives, and alternatives to incarceration programs, some of which, in my experience, aren't that great as alternatives. We'll find out more about that. Before moving to Atlanta, Kamau was part of the Malcolm X grassroots movement in New York City and a lawyer there for a decade, focused on criminal law and civil rights. There is a very good reason I am one of many people interviewing him right now. I'm going to try to keep it short and ask him maybe something some other people haven't asked him yet, because this does get repetitive. And as we said before we went live or went on camera, Kamau, it's great to have you here, but it really sucks that after years of working on stopping Cop City, it took this incredible heightening of things for us to even get on this call together. So again, welcome, but unfortunate circumstances.
No, I appreciate you having me and giving us the ability to even more put the word out. But you're right. You know, we've been doing this since about 2021, when various organizations and activists and collectives heard about the idea of Cop City, and that the city of Atlanta, along with the police department, the Atlanta Police Foundation, were pushing this idea. And, you know, we've been demonstrating and organizing since then. And a lot of times we have been ignored by corporate media, I'll say, which is not always a bad thing, because once they do pick it up, there's a lot of spin in what they say about what's happening in the streets. But yeah, so all that to say is thanks so much for having us. And yeah, this is a long endeavor. It is tragic circumstances which has brought this to the spotlight. But the thing that we've hit on or always talked about is that the reason we're opposed to this is because we know that this facility in and of itself will bring tragic circumstances. We know that the purpose of this facility itself is to do damage to our communities and our movements. And so it's no surprise that even before it's built, that this kind of destruction or this kind of heartbreak would happen at the hands of the police forces in Georgia.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Beautifully said. And we don't need any more martyrs, but it looks like we got one. And any pressure it applies, it doesn't certainly make it worth it, but it maybe makes it a little easier to swallow such a tragedy. From what I understand, Manuel was, not only a wonderful family person, but they were really well loved in the community and really active for years. And that's why perhaps it seems so clearly to be intentional and really an assassination. Interestingly, though, it was almost maybe taken some of the attention away from the real issue. I hope not. I hope, again, because it seems like, thankfully, you're managing still much of the narrative. And by you, of course, I mean the collective you. So hopefully the spin hasn't gone completely crazy yet. But the real issue, it's weird to even say this, but the weird issue is that there's going to be 1 million more Little Turtles. There's going to be, because the whole idea behind this is to create this higher level military style extremist policing that we've been watching cultivate over multiple presidencies. But to tell us more about what Cop City actually is, the extent of it, what it would mean. And then we can get into environmental racism and the destruction of the forest, and we should, but let's just start about what would Cop City be if it gets built?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think going back to what you just said about there will be many more, because there have been many more in the past, is that we already know that policing in this country has been militarized, right? And we already know that, particularly post the 50s and 60s, that the police itself, right, before that also, but really extremely has narrowed in or zeroed in on left Black movements in particular, but obviously not exclusively. And so they save their most insidious tactics for movements, but they also, on an ongoing basis, where what we call sometimes is over policing or using extreme levels of violence against the larger Black community. So, we hear about cases every now and then that come out, and those usually are the cases that bring people out into the streets and mobilizing. But as we know, we saw, people saw the report last year, the most folks ever killed by the police was last year. And so we know that these killings are constant and ongoing and overwhelmingly unjustified, right? And so the police's role, even beyond the killings that take place, is to over police and control our communities, which is why it's led to what we all termed like the prison industrial complex, right? So this over policing, over arrest, and then folks are faced with convictions and long-term sentences, which take them out of their community. So we know all of this is working tandemly. The danger we see in Cop City is that it is a police military base, right? A military base for police, for domestic police. We've already seen documents that show that over 43% of the training that's going to happen is going to happen with police officers or cops outside of Georgia. In addition to that, Georgia, as other police departments, have ongoing relationships with police departments in Israel, which will teach them the tactics and trainings that they use against Palestinians. And then I say in reverse, they also will be learning the tactics and trainings that they use against the Black community. And both of those agencies use against movements fighting against their repression, right? So the danger is that this is basically a hooking up of domestic, because we don't have a national police per se in the United States, other than what you might call the FBI. But this is sort of a hooking up of police departments all over the country in a more concentrated way with military grade weaponry and tactics and international training. So this is not policing. This is a military repression place, a place to learn military repression tactics, again, on movements and communities.
Yeah, and maybe some optimist might say, well, we've given them billions of dollars in military equipment, rocket launchers, tanks, but maybe now that we're training them to use them, they'll be less crazy with them. That optimist is foolish. We've seen also the types of trainings they receive. The trainers literally speak in terms of like enemies, like you have to fight violence with more righteous violence. That's a direct quote. So no, this is not going to help, if anyone even considered that for a second. And yeah, you brought up a larger point too, that it's, to be clear, this is you see it with the riot cops that, maybe get photographed or videoed at a protest. But this is stuff that local small police departments have all over the country and don't just use for protests. They also use this stuff, for instance, for no-knock warrants, which also gained some notoriety when, again, famously, someone was killed.
I think it's important. I'm sorry to interrupt. So I think also when you're saying that, we have to understand that you're right. So this is not like, local policing and interactions. When we even saw what happened a day ago, when here in Georgia, we were doing a news conference with the mother of Manuel, right? At the same time, they planned another raid into the forest. And then they started bringing construction equipment. If you look at the policing, the outfits, the armor, the type of weapons, the vehicles, the armored vehicles they had, this was the police. This wasn't the military. This was supposed to be the police coming in there. And so they're armed to the teeth, right, to fight out movements in our community. And this is only strengthening that. This is not about, you know, stopping a robbery or helping a woman across the street. This is really about having militarized police encampment right here in Atlanta, Georgia, which is going to further just terrorize the larger Black community and other communities here.
There's just like an infinite amount of things to talk about. Like I can't even like keep it all together because like I so desperately want to touch on this is going to directly impact Atlanta. This is going to directly impact our environment. We cannot forget to talk about that. But this is so emblematic of so much more too. Like that's why it is the focus of so many people like myself's attention right now, because the fact that they went and did that additional raid and brought in the construction when you were doing this this important there was this important moment for the community to try to heal and speak truth to power. That was intentional. That's a fuck you. It's an extra slap in the face, which is, it's like they're children or they're gangs, right? Like they're not what we think they are. This idea of protect and serve, they're never walking anyone across the street unless they're really rich and really white and really powerful, because cops don't stop crime. Cops only solve 2% of crime. It's all bullshit, right? And you mentioned the prison industrial complex. That's what it's for. They criminalize places and people, Black community in Atlanta. Send those people off, and that ruins the community, or they try to ruin the community. And then incredible groups like Community Movement Builders and Malcolm X Grassroots Movement do everything they can in their power to prevent the destruction of the community that all of this, would cause without them.
Yeah, I mean, this is really just in terms of actually being policing that adds to gentrification, right? And so this is the kind of policing that happens where, again, not only poor, but poor and working class people are pushed out of Atlanta, pushed out because of the prices of houses, the prices of rents, and the police, through all of their different divisions, become the place or the process in which they slowly push people out. And sometimes not even that slowly, right? The overemphasis on stops and frisks, the overemphasis on car stops, and all those things are targeted towards the Black community here in Atlanta. In Fulton County, over 90% of the arrests are still Black people, even though Black folks make up less than 50% of the population. And we just had word like a few days ago that Fulton County now wants to build a $2 billion jail, in addition to the one that they just rented out from Atlanta, in addition to the one that they already have. So they want to spend $2 billion. They want to raise it and spend it on a jail. And that's probably going to be their biggest spending allocation over the next few years.
Oh, my goodness. Let's just clarify for those who don't know that more than 75% of people in jail have not been convicted of a crime. Think about where those billions of dollars could go alternatively. Also, when we talk about, there being more people killed this year or in 2022 than 2021. That's true. And 2021 was more than 2020. And that has happened for a decade straight. And then on top of that, and with all due respect to Samuel Sinyangwe, who is an amazing person and a friend of mine, this guy, like, he's doing this all by himself, basically collecting this data and confirmed 3+ per day. It is my belief, based on additional research, they're killing more than 6 a day. Okay, a day. And after 2020, they increased funding nationwide. Yes, so we also talked about the media, that whole storyline that defunding caused an increase in crime. Both parts of that story are lies.
Yeah.
And so I don't even know where to continue, but like, because there's so much and I wanted to talk to you for so long, man.
Well, no, I think it's a good place right there to talk about the media's role in all of this.
Okay,
Because you're
perfect.
right.
Is
In
that, yeah.
2020, at the height of defund the police, at the height of abolishing the police, at the height of people talking about finding alternatives to public safety, basically, the elite, including the media elite, it feels like that's when they started thinking about, we need to change this over, even though they had no intention whatsoever of ever defunding their police, right? The police are basically the public army for the use of private corporations. And so they weren't going to really defund anything, but it was part of a public landscape and conversation. And then they wanted to figure out ways to suppress that, right? To push that back down. And so then the crime narrative became the tool for them to do it, right? So obviously, if crime numbers go up because people are coming back outside their homes after an epidemic, that's not shocking. But to portray it as if it was hitting all-time numbers, wasn't even close to the numbers that were in the 90s or 80s in terms of when those statistics were taken. So we know that on its face, this was partly the idea of how do they make the police more lovable again, particularly to the common person. The elites always love them, the political and the corporate elites, right? That's their folks. But they now had to figure out a way to continue to make people scared of each other, scared of going outside. And who do we need to protect us is the police. And so part of the building out of this plan is to do just that, is to bring the police back in vogue, back in fashion, by telling people that there's this crime wave that's happening. And so therefore the police are going to be the ways in which whatever this so-called crime wave is solved. And so that's the crux of the issue, is that we have a country where we have the political and the economic elite and the corporate media, which always work hand in hand, right? They work hand in hand to bring out the idea that we need the police to solve problems, as opposed to understanding, which they understand, which they don't care about, is that the police are the very cause of the problems, because they work for the capitalist state and they work in the nature of preserving that, protecting private properties and damaging folks on the ground.
Beautifully said. And maybe this is an unusual direction from here, but they're also destroying other things, right? And there is such collusion across all of these power holders. So the same corporations that donate to the politicians who write the laws and are the same corporations donating to police foundations that are protecting the police, that are protecting the politicians. The prison industry.
The same corporations that donated to Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 and 2019 and all before that, they had their whole, campaign talking about how Black Lives Matter. These are the same corporations that supposedly support Black lives not being killed by police violence. But at the same time, as these corporations do, they're saying, you know what, we want this audience, but we're not giving up our protection, right? So we're down with the marketing campaign to keep us looking good, to keep consumers coming to us. But really, underneath it all, we're about building out things like Cop City and the police and the private security situation, where they can have mass control over people's movements and protecting what they see as rightly stolen property, right? So
yeah, I saw a list of a shocking, well, I don't know, nothing shocking anymore, but a list of some very well-known corporations who have intentionally and directly invested in Cop City. Do you have that off the top of your head? Are you interested in naming a couple, or you want to move forward? Because it's all of them.
No, I mean, it's a huge amount of corporations, everything from Coca-Cola to UPS, Delta. We've had institutions in Atlanta that we are now targeting that if they have not raised money directly, they've sat on the board of organizations that have raised money for Cop City. Those include Georgia State, Georgia Tech, Morehouse, Spelman. And so every major institution in Atlanta has basically played a role in supporting the building of this militarized complex. So this is not something
HBCUs too.
HBCUs, yeah. So these are not, and you know, we should talk about this too. Just the
Yeah, I know.
activism
I know.
of the student base, which has now started, which
Yeah,
is
let's go there.
extremely important in terms of building out movement.
Absolutely. No, go for it. I like student movements have been, you know, integral to successful movements all over the world. So yes, please. And that's where, although I was raised by an activist mom, you know, the direct action, my years of really putting my body on the line, I was school age. And, you know, that's when you do it. So
Same
please,
thing.
yeah, let's talk about these students who are putting themselves at risk now too.
Yeah, I mean, one of the a colleague of mine, his name is Diallo, Kenyatta Diallo. He noted that that in other countries, when there are potential rebellions or the atmosphere is ripe for radical change, they close down their schools, right? They close down the colleges. They don't want the kids gathered together, the young people gathered together to talk and think and plan and strategize. Here in the United States, they try to open them up more. They try to make sure that those folks, those students, have some sort of conversation with elite politicians, with even the student presidents of their colleges, bringing in corporate elites and so forth and so on. And so they don't fear them as much as the point, right? But we also know that there's times of upheaval in the United States where it is a college-based mass, right? Even if they're not college educated or in college,
Yeah.
but that age range that does the work on the streets, right? That's galvanizing, that's pushing things, that's putting their body out there. There's a little of that that's been lacking recently, right? I think over the last 20 or 30 years, when we think about the debt that's been put on students in terms of school, the push for school to only be a place where you go for careers that make money, but you're not exploring politics or how the world works. You're not thinking outside the box. I think, you know, some of that obviously broke through in after Trayvon Martin was killed, obviously after Mike Ferguson was killed, but we need that to break through really, really big now, right? And so we haven't had that kind of energy on a consistent basis here in Atlanta until now. Until now, where students at Morehouse and Spelman and other schools on connected to it, again, Georgia Tech, Georgia State University, are actually out in the streets and not always connected to some of us who've been doing it for a long time, but through their own analysis and activism and organizing and connecting the dots around what they see as police terror coming down in our communities. And now, and at the very wake of that, the city of Atlanta, through the mayor and the president of Morehouse, are trying to call a private meeting with Morehouse students to try to ease them out of being organizers, right? To try to ease them out of starting a protest movement, try to show them, like, if you come with a suit and tie, that somehow that means everything is going to be fine. So we can see already that the elites are trying to counter what they see as a very serious opposition that can be based in a student movement. Because once the students start going, and once they see beyond not just Cop City, but obviously their own conditions, the conditions in the community, then all bets are off, because they can close those schools down. They can have masses of people out in the street. They can surround City Hall. So having a student movement, a movement of people in their teens, in their early 20s, is paramount to any successful movement going that extra leg, that extra distance in getting things done. And so we just hope through our connections and through our conversations that we can parlay with these students, have the conversations, integrate each other, all of us, into a similar movement background, understanding of what's taking place, so that we can move together.
That's perfect. Because the one thing I was thinking about is, I remember when I was that age, and it never occurred to me to connect with someone. Like, I was in Poughkeepsie, and when I was going to school in Poughkeepsie, and so most of the kids didn't leave campus, right? And so when I'm thinking on campus, I was, co-chair of the activist group, and there was no conversation, zero, about Poughkeepsie. I went down to School of the Americas to protest with that group, I went to Philly and slept on a roof and, did crazy shit for Mumia, but Poughkeepsie was never mentioned. That says a lot to me. And I quickly caught on, and this is not to make myself look good. I wasn't the only one, but I went into Poughkeepsie, and I'll just leave it at that. Although I'll say that my weird alternative to incarceration experience was in Poughkeepsie, for what it's worth. Like I've said, they're very carceral too, unless they're designed by someone like our friend Kamau here.
Well, let me just say on this, because this is important to Atlanta's history, right? So in Atlanta, the so-called city too busy to hate, the agreement has always been that the civil rights movement, even though some of the icons of the civil rights movement come from Atlanta, right? That whatever protest they would do outside of Atlanta, right? So there was never a huge civil rights movement in the city itself to the extent of the sit-ins and everything else. Of course, there was some, but it was almost like a bargain was struck between the economic elite and the political elite and the civil rights movement, right? Now, obviously, there are different parts of the movement in terms of the Black Power movement and everything else that was happening during that time. But it's important to note that here in Atlanta, schools that are elite Black schools like a Morehouse and a Spelman, they want to suppress, right? They want to suppress any radical nature and or ideas, because the thinking of the elite is that we're going to move these people into the positions, particularly of political power, for whatever that's worth, these individuals, and also try to move these individuals into mid-level corporate positions, so that they can be sort of, in terms of the representation politics of it all, the Black folks that they have in these positions, right? So they play a particular role here, some of these schools. And so to have students re-radicalize, or to radicalize in a way in which they're not listening to the mayor. They certainly won't be listening to the governor, but they're not listening to the mayor. They're not necessarily listening to, let's say, an old guard civil rights movement, but they're discovering radical politics, and they're discovering other groups and other organizational efforts around the country. That's what they consider a danger, and that's what we consider a bright light.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's also really telling and tragic, and again, not surprising, that I went to a school in New York, Vassar College, and that's a privilege unto itself, right? And during that time, I had the privilege of learning from Kiese Layman and many other brilliant people. Eileen Leonard, who endorsed our 10 demands, abolitionist cause 20 years later. I was further radicalized in college. Meanwhile, Black institutions for Black students, they're focused on like the Black billionaire. They're focused on like Jay-Z and Nas's Black Republicans. Like they're not building more Kamau Franklins to liberate. They're building people, like you said, to be middle managers and end up the subject of my articles about diversity, equity, and inclusion failures.
Yeah, well, remember the history of Black schools. It wasn't the schools, for the most part, were not started by Black people, right? For the most part, they were started by white entrepreneurs, philanthropists, who wanted to make Black folks look like white folks, or make Black folks acceptable to white folks.
Why?
Those are the origins of those schools. So those schools.
Why? Like why? Like
well, it's racism. It's
yes, of course, but
yeah, I mean, it's
a bizarre form of racism.
Yeah, it's the liberal ethos.
Yeah, okay.
Of right. Look, if we can make them like us, then they're great. Then they're fantastic. Let us do that, as opposed to the conservative side of it, which is no, let's just kill them and enslave them, right? So so that's just the history of those institutions. But there's always, but again, those institutions themselves have at times created radical students, radical student bodies that have taken over president offices, taken over the schools, student bodies that even, let's say, held presidents at bay with some tools. Particularly, this is not student bodies, not exclusively, let's say, HBCUs, but other colleges too, but Black student bodies. So the whole idea of Black student unions were supposed to be a connection between the community and the campus at first. So there's been a process in which students have been radicalized before at these schools and other schools, as all students have. But again, the elite posture, both at Black universities and predominantly white universities, is to continually move folks away from that radicalism, to make them think that their life should be spent, right, pursuing a job for money, because you have so much student loans to pay back now, right? So that you know, no longer exploring the ideas of culture and civilization and society, but let's explore finance. Let's get rich, right? So that's what all of these schools have headed towards and pointed to. They all have their different markers or idols that they put forth in front of people to say, this is where you should be headed. But because of the nature of the society and the contradictions which are on its face around the living conditions, the poverty that's here, the ways that folks are in debt, you cannot hide what's happening in your community from people who come or one step away from being back in that community, or who have a cousin or uncle or whomever that comes from the hood, particularly in the Black community. So the potential to radicalize students or have students gain some real politics is always there, which is why, again, the elites fight so hard to make sure that they clamp down on all that, offer those students a little something here and there, some prestige, some history, and bring them into a particular culture or class strata, and try to make them think that this is what you should be striving for, because there may be a few positions for Black folks in American society, but those positions could belong to you. And so that's
I believe there are 5 Black CEOs. 5.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just be serious. And then oh shit, I swear I had a great thought coming. So you're talking about yes, okay. So I in my experience, it was the Black Student Union that even enabled or facilitated or demanded that we have community conversations on campus, because your privileged vegan is focused on something else. They're not even seeing their microaggressions that are happening that they're doing around them. It's just a whole, and so that's why for me, college was so good, because I got to see all that shit and realize it. But believe me, the amount I've learned since then, the 20 years since, the amount of times, like, you know, Black women have been like, wrong, motherfucker, like that has really helped also.
I said similar. I kicked off most of my organizing and activism when I was a college student, right? Where we did sit-ins in the street to stop traffic. And our first actions were, like, I went to CUNY, I went to Baruch for undergrad, and later on to Brooklyn College for grad school. But when I went to college and, you know, I started getting politicized, the whole thing at that point was around CUNY raising its tuition, because it had just started having tuition maybe a decade or so before I went. But it was the raising of tuition dramatically that brought students out into the street, connected students to what was happening in other campuses. And so folks didn't feel isolated. That fake pride they give you about your campus, it was like that all got took down, because people were meeting each other, talking to each other, and understanding the common experiences that they were going through. And that led to organizations being built, that led to comrades, that led to collectives, that led to a movement in the city in New York in the 90s that was against student tuition, that brought out massive amounts of people, literally thousands of people in the street. And that was a great politicizing experience for me, as I hope that if the students continue here in Atlanta, fighting against Cop City will help be one of those politicizing experiences for them.
Yes, I absolutely hope so. And the truth is that we can't look at any single one of the, like, even if it doesn't mobilize them to the degree that you and I are envisioning, it's not a failure. The 2020 protests were also not a failure. The the amount of people who even know what abolition is, the amount of neoliberals I've converted to abolitionists since George Floyd, who said, oh, now I understand what you've been saying, Black Lives Matter. I didn't get it for the last 3 years or whatever. My hero Dylan Rodriguez talks about this all the time. It's like a tapestry of collective organizing and forward progress. And so even if you weren't like, even if, well, it is the case, students are charged to go to CUNY, and even if there are union issues with the employees, and it's better than it was, and we remember our mistakes, our successes, we've made those connections that you're talking about, that we continue to use to make forward progress. I have the same hopes for Atlanta. I find this moment in time both scary and very exciting.
We don't know, because we don't know necessarily.
Exactly.
Is my honest opinion, right? I don't know if we're going to be able to stop the building of Cop City. We have
Oh,
Capitol
yeah.
on one side, you have the police on one side, you have the political elite on one side, you have the news media on one side, and you have us on the other, right?
I know.
But we've done something over the last year and a half, particularly when there's been a lull in movement organizing, at least stuff that we could see and touch that seemed tangible and growing.
Yeah.
One of the things I will say with great delight about the folks that I've worked with, they've come from all different stripes in terms of political orientations and ideologies from different communities. And we've been able to hold together a loose collective, a decentralized, as they like to say, decentralized collective of people who are getting to know each other, working with each other. And as you said, if we do our job correctly, can only build from there to potentially stop the next thing and to fight harder for the next thing. We've got to get to a place in our movement, of course, when we're winning some of these struggles. But we can only have that when the lulls happen and we're not falling apart. But those are actually strategies and strategy sessions and planning sessions, so that we can get bigger and build out larger movements, not only locally, but connected nationally, and to be honest, connected internationally, right? Mm-hmm. Capital does not have borders. Capital goes all over the place. If we don't have a movement that's both local, national, and international, then we are destined to lose.
Boom. Yeah, you said it all right there. And I honestly think that this could be one of those times, particularly because this is you called it a rainbow. I think maybe you didn't. I'm just thinking rainbow coalition. I
didn't call it a rainbow. No.
Yeah. All right. But whatever you called it. Oh, you said stripes. You said stripes, different stripes. This brings me to a timely point, and I know we're running low on time here. It is so critical to have intersectionality and organizing that is respectful and also led by directly impacted people. And it's so wonderful to hear about a lot of stripes, but it does. And also, you mentioned, again, going back to the CUNY situation, one thing we haven't talked about that cops are also doing throughout the gentrification of our communities, or more likely, your community than mine, is homeless or houseless sweeps, right? And so that is another part of it too. And not every houseless person is an addict. Not every houseless person is crazy. Not every houseless person is a vet. Not every houseless person is a man, Black, single. There are families on the streets this is happening to. And anyway, my point being that it is economic, and you can't talk about race without economics, and not because they're the same, but because economics is the way the United States has used Black bodies and lives and then continued to enslave them through the prison industrial complex. Having said all of that, would you organize with a Proud Boy?
No, well, I wouldn't do that, but
good answer.
But I do. I mean, I'll come back to the Proud Boy, because I think you hit on an important point around the economics of it all, right? The class analysis of it all. It was in the 1980s that Atlanta started sweeping away the homeless population. It shut down all of its public housing, 80s, 90s, and beyond, where there's no public housing in Atlanta anymore. And so the political elites and the economic elites have over and over again driven poor and working class people out of this city to make it a playground for the corporate elite and their employees. And so they did that at a very particular point when the Olympics were coming. And so we see some of the manifestation of Cop City boiled into or baked into the idea that Atlanta is now competing to have the World Cup come here. The fact that Buckhead, which for folks who don't know is the northern part of Atlanta, but where the corporate elite is threatening to leave the city and form their own city, and the powers that be are doing everything possible to do what they want or what they want to have, as opposed to worrying about the working class populations that they're pushing out. So when I talk about working with folks of all stripes, I'm talking about people on the various wavelengths of the left, right? So everybody from anarchists to nationalists to civil rights folks to community folks. But I do, for me, I draw a line with, even if I have some agreement on individual issues with some people, or there's some overlap, obviously, with politics, if somebody fundamentally, in my estimation, has fascist tendencies or fascist ideas, I can't get over that for the single issue work. So, yeah.
Yeah, good answer. I feel the same way. But I think it also, in cases where we are seeing this happen, with at least self-proclaimed leftists being willing to do that, maybe it's just, I mean, I don't know, it could be a lot of things, but one thing that I'm seeing is, at least from my perspective, because I'm not involved, it appears to me that they're for isolated events as opposed to long-term organizing. And if I'm right about that, I'm very thankful, because the biggest concern I have with finding, because as an abolitionist, I believe that all of these people that want you dead, and as a Jew, they want me dead, maybe are just victims of generations of disinformation and have never met. I mean, there are people who think Jews have horns in this country, so maybe they've never met a guy like you or whatever. But at the same time, until I'm sure that they're not a Proud Boy, maybe I'll show up at the same event. I mean, maybe, but no, right? Like the point.
Yeah, my position is, obviously, if you do some work,
security is important, is it not?
Yeah. If you do some work that helps to politicize people, to move them from one politic to another, I think that's fantastic work, right? That's great work, whether you do it accidentally or you do it on purpose.
It's not your job for what it's worth.
Well, one, it's not my job, but two, there's a difference between saying I'm trying to move people politically than showing up publicly with them at events and having a cross section of groups say that you're fighting on these single issues. I think it only empowers certain ideologies. It doesn't take away from their strength or their practice. And so I'm all for people working in their community or various communities to politicize people and bring people along. But I take a lot of people, particularly when it comes to something like a right-wing ideology, is like, if you're saying you're a fascist, then to me, or you're saying that you represent certain things that spells out a fascist program to me, then that's one step too far. Again, on your journey, if you get better, you do different. There may be a space to work together, but like you said, I've got so much individually, or my perspective of it is, there's so much work to do in my own arena. Right. That's not the time I'm taking to do that, and nor do I think necessarily that the results that people think they're going to get, they are going to get. Right?
Yeah, I'm being hopeful. I'm being a true lover, not hater, when I talk like that. This took many years because I spent my youth beating up Nazis. So, okay, we have so little time, and I really wanted to, I think I need to have you back if you'd be willing, because I want to talk about more about Cop City specifically, more about your past experience, more about environmental racism. But because I love to always ask a couple questions to everybody, because there's only a certain type of people I bring on, and we only have a few minutes, let me just ask you, what can people do in their communities? And particularly if they don't, for, you know, whether it's for economic reasons, for physical capabilities reasons, they can't protest.
I mean, we always ask people, obviously, you know, with the advent of social media, there's ways for folks to get involved. There's petitions that are up. There's ways that people can post social media posts that so that they say that they are supporters of stopping Cop City from being built. There's calls that people can make to the mayor's office, to these corporations, to the developers, to tell them to pull out of doing this kind of work, that this work is dangerous for the community. So if folks cannot come out into the streets, and we do understand that there's folks who cannot, there's a lot of different ways that folks can get involved: emails, phone calls, text messages, things that they can do to continue to put the pressure on the city and the corporations and the developers of this project to let them know you will catch hell if you continue to work on this project. It just won't be, it'll be the hardest work that you've ever done if you continue to try to do this.
Yeah, exactly. That's perfect. It reminds me of the 10 demands open letter that people can send. I wrote it a while ago, but, or I should say we wrote it a while ago, but when we set it up, we were like, because it goes to your elected officials. It's like, you know, basically the same idea. If you don't do this, if you don't like side with us about defunding starting now, we are going to make your reelection a living hell. Like that's kind of the idea.
Yeah.
All right, to close up, abolition, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And that's, to me, the most interesting thing about it, is getting everyone's take on what it means to them. So before I let you go, what is abolition to you?
Well, abolition to me is part of a process of a revolutionary struggle, to be honest. So you have no abolition without a revolutionary struggle. Just like earlier I said, you're not going to abolish the police until you deal with the state that produces the police, until you deal with the corporations that control the police, that pay for the police. And so abolition is not going to happen outside of the context of a radical revolutionary struggle against the very state itself, which is supporting, supplying, and bringing the police on. And so I think of it in that context. So I usually still refer to, at least my ideas, as being radical or revolutionary nationalist in nature. And the idea of abolition, you know, as I read through George Jackson years ago, you know, is the idea that you abolish it, but you abolish it within the context of fighting the state. If you're not fighting the state, but you're trying to fight the tentacles of the state, and then you're losing the struggle because you're not seeing that the state may appease you in some way that you think you've won, but all they're doing is replacing one name for another name. And so keeping our eyes on where the real power is what I think abolition is about.
Yeah, I like that. And I think you implied or hinted at all of these reforms, the George Floyd Act, for instance. This is them placating us. This is this renaming of things when nothing actually changes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Meanwhile, though, people in their communities are setting up alternatives. There's even a website, Who Can I Call, where it goes city by city, so you don't have to call the police. That's cool, right? Like, at least we've got that going.
No, that's extremely. We ourselves do cop watches and safety walks in the community where we're located in. So, you know, so instead of calling the police, we give out Know Your Rights. We have a number that folks can call. We've had training in de-escalation tactics. So those are the things that are important for us. We do mutual aid work. We call our liberation programs, where with the community, we give out food and groceries and toiletries. Folks come, they engage in political education. They help tell us who else needs the support. They help pack the groceries. We have a sustainability fund that once a year, we give out $750 to anybody who lives in a certain radius, any Black family that lives in a particular radius, so they can pay their mortgage, their utility bill, and or their rent. We'll team them up with real social service agencies that have more resources. But we do all of that to connect ourselves and to connect the community together, because until we do that, people are always going to rely on what they know, what has those resources. even if innately there's a danger to it, it's what they have.
That's beautiful, man. And that's why you're a hero of mine as well. Alex Mingus, who I'm starting a podcast with, was the guy who went viral for taking his award for valor from the police in Minneapolis, in St. Paul, and saying "fuck you." He is a street medic. He spends his days walking around protecting people from cops and fixing situations in ways that are nonviolent and non-police related. He's also my hero. You guys all do incredible work, and it's so important. And by explaining what you're doing in Atlanta, I'm so glad we ended this way, because my advice to my listeners is to go do all of that in your communities as well.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
Thank you, man. This has been great, and I will have you on if you'll join me. Keep doing the amazing work.
Thank you.
All right, brother.
All right,
Peace.
peace.